In the last days of April of 1945, Adolf Hitler gathered his closest circle inside the Führerbunker. It was not a military meeting, nor a war council. It was the final scene of a power that was extinguishing. Hitler was no longer seeking strategies, he was seeking reaffirmations. He spoke to men who knew that everything was over, but who continued to listen in silence. His mind alternated between euphoria and denial. He ordered impossible movements, blamed his generals, and proclaimed himself a victim of the people who had betrayed him. Those words were not instructions, they were fragments of a reality that only existed in his head. What really happened inside that last meeting? What was Hitler thinking as his world collapsed in front of him? Berlin underground, the twilight of the Third Reich. April of 1945 marked the end of Berlin as a capital and the beginning of its existence as a battlefield. The Soviet artillery fell relentlessly on a city turned into a skeleton of itself. Columns of smoke rose among gutted buildings, while the Red Army advanced from all fronts with unwavering determination. In the streets, trapped civilians sought refuge among flooded basements and smouldering ruins. The German soldiers, many barely teenagers or elderly men of the Volkssturm, resisted without ammunition or real coordination, sustained only by the inertia of orders that no longer made sense. Under that destroyed surface, at more than 8 meters deep, lay the Führerbunker. 2 levels of reinforced concrete, more than 3 meters thick in the walls, connected to the chancellery by narrow corridors that seemed to lead into the interior of a tomb. There were no windows, no sky, only yellowish electric lights that flickered with each impact on the surface, and a stale air that permanently smelled of fuel, dampness, and rancid cigarettes. Between 70 and 90 people inhabited that claustrophobic labyrinth. Officers, secretaries, doctors, cooks, and SS guards, all trapped in the last stronghold of a disintegrating empire. In the center of that closed universe, Adolf Hitler had ceased to be the leader who dominated Europe. His body showed the signs of accelerated deterioration, constant tremors in the left hand, ashen face, gaze that swung between fury and emptiness. He walked, dragging one foot, holding onto the furniture to maintain balance. He spent hours in front of maps that represented non-existent armies, marking positions of divisions that had dissolved weeks earlier. The man who had demanded absolute obedience from millions now depended on his aides to get up from the chair. At the beginning of April, Hitler ordered his almost permanent relocation to the bunker. Since then, he rarely went up to the surface. The morning meetings with the general staff took place in the conference room, where officers drew lines on outdated maps while the reality of the Eastern Front collapsed kilometre by kilometre. The reports arriving from outside spoke of annihilated divisions, exhausted supplies, and severed communications. However, in the bunker, the fiction of an operational command persisted. No one dared to utter the word defeat. The atmosphere was dense, saturated with tense silences. In the corridors, the officers spoke in whispers, aware that any pessimistic comment could be interpreted as treason. The cult of loyalty had replaced military logic. Hitler demanded reports that confirmed his illusions of impossible counter-offensives. His immediate circle fed these fantasies with half-truths. Martin Bormann controlled the flow of information, Joseph Goebbels repeated slogans of heroic resistance, and the generals Wilhelm Burgdorf and Hans Krebs presented manipulated data to avoid outbursts of anger. A closed universe had been constructed where reality was a threat. Everyday life unfolded with mechanical routine. The secretaries typed out orders that would never reach their destination. The cooks served modest meals on porcelain dishes, vestiges of normalcy amid the collapse. Eva Braun smoked in her room, listened to music, and wrote letters she knew she would not send. Dr. Theodor Morell injected cocktails of vitamins and stimulants that barely masked the Führer's exhaustion. The nights were endless. Hitler slept little, paced the halls, and called impromptu meetings where he repeated the same delusional orders. By mid-April, the Soviet encirclement of Berlin was complete. The troops of the Red Army had crossed the Oder and were advancing towards the center with concentrated fire. The combats were taking place house by house, avenue by avenue. The improvised defenses barely slowed the enemy advance. However, inside the bunker there persisted a sense of unreal isolation, as if time had stopped underground. The noise of the cannons served as a clock. Each detonation marked one more minute closer to the end. On the 20th of April, Hitler's 56th birthday, the atmosphere became even more somber. In the devastated garden above the bunker, a brief ceremony was held where young members of the Hitler Youth received medals. It was the Führer's last public appearance. The images show him pale, with awkward movements, trying to maintain the stiffness of yesteryear in front of children who looked at him with admiration and fear. That night, as explosions shook the concrete walls, Hitler informed his aides that he would not leave Berlin under any circumstances. Loyalty then became condemnation. The High Command understood that the war was lost, but no one dared to say it. When someone suggested retreat or surrender, Hitler reacted with uncontrolled fury, banging on the table, accusing everyone present of cowardice. For him, surrender equated to betrayal. Defeat could not be accepted, only explained as the result of others' disloyalty. This conviction fueled a desperate fanaticism in those around him. Outside, the Reich's military structure was rapidly collapsing. Communications with the Western Front were cut. In the north, Allied forces were advancing on the Elbe. In the east, Soviet armies were penetrating toward the heart of the capital. The German divisions, exhausted and without fuel, were absorbed by the tide of fire. The last orders issued from the bunker demanded total resistance, summary executions of deserters, and exemplary punishments. The distance between the Führer's word and the reality of the battlefield was absolute. The circle of power diminished day by day. Some officers were authorized to escape. Others disappeared in the confusion. Those who remained formed the last ring of loyalty: Goebbels, Bormann, Krebs, Burgdorf, Eids Heinzlinger and Otto Günscher, and the secretaries. Eva Braun was also there, having arrived in Berlin days earlier, ignoring all warnings. Her presence symbolized the closing of the cycle, the union between Hitler's private myth and political destiny. In the corridors of the bunker, the atmosphere became increasingly claustrophobic. The explosions rumbled at regular intervals, making the walls vibrate. The lights flickered. The damp floor was covered with dust and water seeping from the upper levels. The employees improvised barriers with towels to prevent flooding. The noise of the cannons measured the time with relentless precision. Hitler spent hours in front of the map of the Eastern Front. His movements were slow, clumsy. He asked for reports on divisions that no longer existed. He spoke of imaginary counterattacks, of units that would march from the north to liberate Berlin. General Steiner, he said, could still attack. None of those present dared to contradict him. When Krebs tried to explain that the routes were cut off, Hitler interrupted him violently. That strategic illusion had become his last mental refuge. The contrast between the magnitude of the collapse and the routine inside the bunker was almost unreal. While above the city burned, below meals were served at fixed times, radio parts were listened to, and phantom troop movements were discussed. Goebbels dictated communiques where he spoke of the heroic resistance of Berlin. On the damp walls, the portraits of the Führer remained hanging, as if nothing had changed. The morale of the group oscillated between fatalism and blind faith. Some were hoping for a military miracle. Others resigned themselves to die there. The line separating loyalty from fear was blurred. Outside, the Soviet columns could already be seen from the ruined roofs. Inside, conversations revolved around how to face the end: resist, escape, or follow the leader in his decision to die. The word surrender was not spoken, not even in a whisper. The bunker, with its narrow corridors and constant electric light, had become a physical symbol of the regime's mental state, a closed space, isolated from the world, sustained by fear and denial. In those final days, The Führer and his circle were not only underground in the literal sense, they were also immersed in their own myth. What was once presented as a fortress was now a tomb. The physical deterioration of Hitler was reflected in his surroundings. His aides, exhausted by the lack of sleep, performed duties with automatic precision. The silence among them was more eloquent than any word. Some looked indifferently at the leader's portraits. Others avoided meeting his gaze. They knew that defeat was no longer a possibility. It was a reality that spread meter by meter over their heads. As the Soviet cannons approached, the vibrations of the ground became more intense. The walls of the bunker shook as if the concrete was breathing. The ceilings dripped water mixed with dust. At certain moments, the electricity failed and the darkness was total. Only then, in that momentary silence, were the held breaths, the ticking of the clocks, the sighs of those who knew there was no way out heard. The Führerbunker was, at that time, a complete metaphor of the Third Reich, a refuge built to protect power, turned into a tomb by its own obstinacy. The thick walls kept the real world out, but they could not stop the moral decay that advanced from within. The leader who had demanded absolute obedience now only retained the loyalty of a handful of followers locked in with him in the darkness. Outside, the Soviet cannons were preparing for the final assault. Inside, the walls of the bunker contained the silence of an era that was dying, the echo of loyalty, the last faithful. In the damp corridors of the Führerbunker, time had turned into a succession of empty gestures. The typewriters sounded like echoes of a ghost administration. Orders were drafted that no one would receive. Documents were sealed that would never be delivered. Yet each action kept alive the ritual of obedience, as if that routine could stop the imminent collapse. Those who remained in the bunker during the last days did not do so by chance. They were part of a circle of loyalty woven over more than a decade. They had shared the rise of the regime, thrived on absolute power, and now did not know how to exist outside of it. Each one represented a different facet of fidelity to the Führer: ideological fanaticism, personal dependence, military inertia, or the simple inability to imagine another destiny. Joseph Goebbels was the most fervent of all. From the early years of the Nazi movement, he had been the most eloquent interpreter of the cult of Hitler. His faith had not weakened in the face of evidence of disaster. In those final days, his extreme thinness, his nervous step, and his feverish gaze reflected a man completely identified with the lost cause. He moved around the bunker like a priest officiating a ceremony without believers. He spoke of sacrifice, of honor, of loyalty until death. His wife, Magda, shared the same conviction. She had decided that their 6 children would die with them because she could not conceive of them living in a world without National Socialism. In her words, maternal love and political devotion were confused. For her, killing her children would be saving them from dishonor. Martin Bormann represented another kind of loyalty, that of the bureaucrat who has woven his power from the shadows. For years he had controlled access to the Führer, filtered documents, manipulated rivalries. In the bunker, he continued to play that role. He controlled the communications, regulated the visits, decided which messages reached Hitler. His presence was felt in every corner, a silent, pragmatic figure, without illusions, but clinging to the mechanism of command. In the final days, his influence was less political than psychological. He kept the fiction alive that the government was still functioning, even though the country no longer existed. In the military field, Generals Hans Krebs and Wilhelm Burgdorf held the positions of liaison and advisors. They knew that the army was destroyed, but they continued to present daily reports. They wrote with precision on the maps, drew lines that were instantly erased under new orders. Their loyalty did not come from ideological fanaticism, but from the habit of discipline. They had been trained to obey, not to rebel. In them, obedience had turned into resignation. The more evident the defeat became, the more rigid their conduct became. Among the secretaries, the atmosphere swung between submission and disbelief. Traudl Junge, Gerda Christian, and the others continued typing orders, transcribing the thoughts of a dying regime. Sometimes they heard the explosions and paused for a second, but then returned to the keyboard. They had spent years at the service of the Führer, and they could not abandon the assigned role. They knew that the doors of the bunker led to death or to the Soviets, and neither of those destinies seemed to offer salvation. Eva Braun was the emotional exception in that closed world. She had no political power nor military authority. She was the personal companion of the dictator. Her presence introduced a strange note in the midst of the disaster. She dressed carefully, applied makeup, tried to maintain some normality. Some considered her frivolous, but her decision to stay in Berlin revealed another kind of loyalty, that of personal sacrifice. She could have fled, but she chose to remain by Hitler's side, knowing that it amounted to accepting death. Her presence symbolized the intimate dimension of fanaticism. The rest of the staff continued to fulfill their duty mechanically. Heinz Linger, Hitler's valet, kept order in the private quarters with obsessive meticulousness. Otto Günscher was in charge of coordinating internal security. Rokas Misch remained in the communications room, recording increasingly brief and desperate calls. Everyone knew that the end was imminent, but no one dared to disobey. In the bunker, loyalty had become a form of mental survival. As long as they continued to follow orders, they could pretend that there was still a purpose. The tensions were visible. Goebbels despised the military, considering them guilty of the defeat. The army officers saw the party leaders as fanatics who prevented a rational surrender. Between both sides there was silent hostility, contained by common fear. No one wanted to be the first to break the facade of unity. Hitler, increasingly irritable, fueled these divisions with his verbal attacks. He alternated between rage and apathy. At some moments, he burst into screams against his generals. At others, he shut himself in absolute silence, oblivious to everything. In that atmosphere of isolation, the idea of loyalty took on an almost religious meaning. Every daily gesture, preparing a meal, writing an order, staying at the post, was a kind of ritual. They had spent years repeating the discourse of sacrifice for the nation, and now they were carrying it to its ultimate consequences. Outside, the German people were suffering the bombings and the invasion. Inside, the leaders who had led them to the catastrophe were preparing to die as martyrs of their own cause. It was an absolute moral distortion, but inside the bunker, no one perceived it that way. The self-destruction was interpreted as an act of coherence. Goebbels had assumed the role of spokesperson for destiny. In night meetings, he repeated that the end had to be exemplary, that his death and that of Hitler would be a message for history. Sometimes he made impromptu speeches, without a real audience, as if speaking to an invisible people. His voice echoed in the halls with a conviction that no longer had an object. Each sentence reinforced the feeling that they were participating in a closing ceremony rather than a military defense. In his mind, the collective sacrifice would redeem the defeat. Bormann, more pragmatic, took care of the administrative details of the end. He reviewed documents, prepared inventories, organized shift changes. His obsession with order persisted even when everything was collapsing. He ensured that Hitler's will papers were ready, that the signatures were authentic, and that the copies were sent to their destination. He was the bureaucrat of the apocalypse, maintaining order within chaos. His loyalty did not have the emotion of Goebbels, but it was just as relentless. The officers Krebs and Burgdorf moved with almost robotic discipline. They participated in meetings where there were no longer any real decisions to be made. They reported on destroyed units, received reprimands, nodded silently. They were men trapped by duty. The Prussian army doctrine, which turned obedience into virtue, kept them immobile, even when the command had lost its reason. On their faces could be seen the weight of a loyalty that was no longer faith, but condemnation. Among the secretaries, fear mingled with routine. They had known the Führer in moments of absolute power, and now saw him physically wasting away. The conversations among them revolved around rumors of escape, possible escape routes, the proximity of the enemy. Some cried silently at night, others took refuge in the mechanical task of writing. The last words of the regime passed through their hands, dictated by a man who no longer controlled anything more than his confinement. Eva Braun tried to maintain an appearance of serenity. She spent the time in her room, listening to the muffled sound of the cannons. She smoked in silence, wrote brief notes, arranged her few belongings. Sometimes, when the atmosphere became unbearable, she went out into the hallway and talked to the secretaries about trivialities, a dress, a song, a memory. Those chats were a futile attempt to preserve the illusion of normality. In everyone's gaze, the certainty that none of it made sense was reflected. Hitler, at the center of that closed universe, had become an inaccessible being. He barely ate, slept little, spent hours reviewing reports and murmuring in a low voice. Others treated him with a mixture of fear and veneration. When he walked through the corridors, conversations stopped. No one knew if they would find the leader furious or dejected. Loyalty towards him was no longer rational. It was a kind of collective hypnosis. After years of worshipping the Führer, those who remained in his circle did not know how to think without him. Obeying him was the only way they had left to exist. In that suffocating microcosm, each person reacted differently to the end. Goebbels and his wife awaited it with solemnity, convinced that they would die for a sacred cause. Bormann accepted it as an inevitable consequence, although he still dreamed of escaping. The generals accepted it with discipline. The service staff contemplated it with resignation. Eva Braun saw it as an act of final union, and Hitler, in the center, conceived it as the logical outcome of his destiny. If the Reich had to disappear, he would disappear with it. The last nights were a succession of silences broken by explosions. In the hallways, the echoes of the bombing mingled with hurried footsteps and doors opening and closing. On the tables were remains of unfinished meals, coffee-stained documents, cigarette butts. The air smelled of humidity and sweat. The feeling of confinement was so intense that some began to experience disorientation and anxiety attacks. Even so, no one dared to leave the place without permission. From time to time, news from the outside arrived. A messenger reported the loss of a position or the proximity of Soviet troops. Each report was received with the same mix of indifference and fatalism. Strategies were no longer discussed, only the inevitable was confirmed. A silent acceptance could be read on the faces. In the language of the bunker, the word end began to replace all others. Isolation reinforced loyalty. Those who had remained there felt like the last guardians of a dying faith. Each one, in their own way, was preparing to die for it. Some did it with fervor, others with resignation. But all shared the same idea, that loyalty was more important than life. In that thought was blended the ultimate meaning of Nazism, reduced to its darkest essence, the negation of the human in the name of a total idea. The echo of loyalty in those final days was stronger than the roar of war. It was not the echo of a living faith, but that of a petrified devotion. The Führerbunker had become a capsule outside of time, where defeat could not be recognized because doing so meant destroying the very reason for its existence. Hitler had built a system based on total obedience, and that system accompanied him until his last breath. Loyalty had become an echo, a hollow reflection that resonated in the underground corridors while above the city was dying. The final message, the meeting of April 22nd, 1945. April 22nd, 1945, dawned with a distinct silence in the bunker. It was not calm, but tense stillness, the moment that precedes a collapse. Above, the roar of Soviet cannons was ever closer. The ground trembled under each detonation, and the stale air of the underground was permeated with dust dislodged from the ceiling. In the corridors, the faces of the personnel reflected the fatigue of weeks without rest. No one slept more than a few hours. No one believed anymore in the promised victories. The war had reached the door of the shelter. In the mid-morning, the liaison officers brought the report that would change the tone of the entire lockdown. The strike group led by General Steiner, to whom Hitler had entrusted the mission of breaking the Soviet encirclement and liberating Berlin from the north, had not advanced. The counterattack, presented as the Reich's last hope, had disintegrated before it began. The units existed only on the maps, scattered, without fuel or ammunition. It was the final confirmation that there were no forces left capable of reversing the course of the war. When Hitler received the news, the silence was absolute. For a few seconds, he remained motionless, looking at the maps spread out on the table. Then his face contracted. He requested that all the present leaders gather immediately. The order traveled through the halls like a storm warning. The attendees knew that something serious was going to happen. In the conference room, maps hung from the walls, covered with marks and erasures. The clocks indicated almost noon when the Führer entered. He walked with slow steps, but his gaze had a strange shine, a mixture of anger and exhaustion. He leaned on the table and began to speak. At first his voice was low, barely audible, a murmur that blended with the hum of the fans. Then it rose in pitch until it turned into screams. The outburst was sudden, as if all the tension accumulated over weeks was released all at once. Those present were paralyzed. Hitler was pounding the map with his fist, accusing his generals of treason, cowardice, incompetence. His words were mixed with insults and impossible orders. He denounced that no one had followed his instructions, that the army had abandoned him, that the German people had not deserved his sacrifice. In that burst of fury, the myth of the infallible leader shattered completely. His movements were uncontrolled, his voice broken. In the room, there was a mixture of fear and compassion. Some officers avoided looking at him directly. Others kept their eyes fixed on the maps, pretending to take notes. It was a spectacle of self-destruction. The man who had demanded absolute obedience from millions of people was collapsing in front of a dozen subordinates, a prisoner of his own rhetoric. Suddenly, the voice went silent. Hitler let himself fall into the chair, with his shoulders slumped. His breathing was labored, his face covered in sweat. He remained like that for a few seconds, without speaking. Then, in a cold, almost monotonous tone, he uttered the words that would seal the fate of all present. The war was lost. Berlin would not be liberated, and he would not leave the city. He said that he would not flee like a fugitive, nor surrender to the enemy. He would remain in the capital and would kill himself when the time came. He would do so to avoid falling into Soviet hands and to leave the Germans the example of his decision. No one answered. The silence that followed was more violent than the previous explosion. The officers remained motionless, aware that they had heard the regime's final verdict. Hitler slowly straightened up, leaning on the table. His voice returned to a more controlled, almost didactic tone. He spoke of betrayals, conspiracies, internal enemies. He claimed that the Germans had not lived up to their historical mission, that the people had failed their leader, and that, therefore, they deserved their fate. In those final phrases, spoken with coldness, the most perverse logic of his thinking was condensed. Defeat was not the fault of the power, but of the people who had not been worthy of it. Those present understood that this was Hitler's last speech as commander. He was no longer giving orders, no longer planning movements. He spoke like a man closing a chapter, explaining his failure to the only audience that still listened to him. His tone alternated between resignation and wounded pride. At times he seemed to lament. At others he became exalted again, proclaiming that his example should serve posterity. It was a farewell monologue, disguised as a military report. Joseph Goebbels listened with a mixture of devotion and ecstasy. For him, those words confirmed the prophecy he had repeated for years, the Führer's sacrifice as a redemptive act. His face lit up with a kind of religious fervor. In contrast, the generals remained motionless, with empty expressions. They knew the war was over, but still could not accept that the Supreme Command would dissolve like that, in an outburst of rage. When the meeting ended, Hitler stood up slowly, and left the room without looking at anyone. Behind him, the group remained silent. No one dared to speak until the door closed. The tension was so dense that it seemed to fill all the air. Some breathed a sigh of relief. Others remained still, as if they could still hear his voice echoing on the walls. Outside, the Soviet cannons kept firing. Inside the bunker, something had changed forever. The leader who had governed the country for 12 years had just acknowledged, although not in those words, that everything was lost. The following hours passed in a mixture of chaos and paralysis. Some officers tried to contact units outside, but the lines were cut. Others began preparing escape routes. In the corridors, rumors multiplied. It was said that Hitler had suffered a nervous breakdown, that he had fainted, that he was sick. But those who had been in the room knew the truth. The Führer had decided to die in Berlin. The emotional collapse of the morning gave way to a heavy silence. Hitler remained locked in his room for much of the day. He refused to receive visitors. The secretaries heard footsteps behind the door, the rustling of papers, the sound of the lighter. When he finally emerged, his face was a mask of calm. He had moved from fury to determination. He ordered some of his aides to prepare to transmit new directives, but it was no longer about military strategies, but measures for the end: the arrangement of the bunker, the destruction of documents, the selection of those who could attempt to escape. For the first time, Hitler accepted that others could be saved. He gave permission to several people to leave Berlin. Some interpreted it as an act of humanity, others as a sign that the leader had given up everything. In reality, it was a logical consequence of his decision. He would die in the center of the capital, but the others could carry his message outside. He wanted witnesses to his end, not survivors who would contradict him. During the afternoon, Goebbels met with him to reaffirm his loyalty. It was a brief but decisive meeting. Goebbels declared that he would not abandon him, that he would die alongside him. Hitler listened with apparent indifference, as if he already expected that answer. From that moment on, Goebbels became the moral custodian of the end. Around him, the others began to accept that history would close right there, underground. The atmosphere of the bunker changed completely after that day. Despair transformed into a strange serenity. Each person seemed to have found their role in the drama. The military organized the final reports. The secretaries prepared the machines to type the testament. The guards reviewed the escape tunnels. Eva Braun dedicated herself to arranging her personal belongings. Goebbels and Magda began to speak openly about death, as if it were an inevitable appointment. In the hours after the meeting, Hitler returned to the map room. He silently observed the lines marking the city and the fronts. He no longer looked for routes of advance. He only wanted to confirm that the encirclement was complete. He asked about the distance of the Soviet troops to the center. He was informed that they were less than 3 kilometers away. He nodded silently. In that gesture was summarized the acceptance of fate. The meeting on the 22nd of April was Hitler's last act of authority, although he left no useful orders. More than a command session, it was an involuntary confession. In it, the illusion of invincibility that had sustained the regime collapsed. For the first time, his voice did not command. It justified. His words no longer sought to conquer, but to explain the defeat without admitting responsibility. It was the final attempt to maintain narrative control even as reality crumbled. That afternoon, as the noise of the artillery grew more intense, the members of the inner circle began to move like pieces within a ritual. No one mentioned the word suicide, but everyone knew it was the expected outcome. Some took refuge in work, others in alcohol. The secretaries, with trembling hands, copied the last orders, not knowing if anyone would read them. On each face, there was a mixture of fear, disbelief, and strange calm. The logic of the bunker had replaced the instinct for survival. Obeying was easier than thinking. That night, Hitler ate little. He remained silent during dinner, staring at his plate without touching it. The others pretended to have a normal conversation. Goebbels talked about history, about how great leaders had always been misunderstood. Eva Braun smiled weakly. No one mentioned the final word, but everyone felt it, floating in the air. When Hitler retired to his room, the others remained at the table for a few minutes, not knowing whether they should continue talking or get up. It was Goebbels who broke the silence. He said that history was being fulfilled, that they were witnessing something unique. No one responded. The meeting of April 22nd and the subsequent hours marked the transition from power to delirium. After that day, Hitler ceased to be a leader and became a symbol, speaking only to himself. Everything he would do from then on, the wills, the farewells, the organization of his death, would be an extension of that final speech. He had turned the end of the Reich into a personal act, a performance intended to perpetuate his image. In that room, illuminated by flickering light bulbs and filled with useless maps, the end of the Reich was sealed. What followed was not politics nor war, but ceremony, the political testament, the farewell. The night of the 28th of April of 1945 descended upon the bunker with an almost physical density. Above, Berlin burned silently, illuminated by fires that gave the sky a reddish glow. Underground, the air had become heavy, saturated with smoke and static electricity. Each explosion made the concrete vibrate, as if the heart of the city were disintegrating. In the hallways of the Führerbunker, the feeling of enclosure was total. No one spoke of the war anymore. There was no longer strategy or hope. Only waiting for the outcome remained. Hitler had not left his quarters for days. He ate little, slept less, and spent hours sitting in front of the map of the Eastern Front, silently observing the lines that represented armies that no longer existed. His face, pale and exhausted, looked like that of a much older man. His hands trembled constantly. The aides spoke in low voices, avoiding any conversation about the outside. By that point, the war had ceased to be a reality and had become an abstraction. On the afternoon of the 28th, a messenger brought the news that would shatter any remaining shred of faith. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS and one of the most powerful men in the regime, had attempted to secretly negotiate a partial surrender with the Western Allies. Hitler received the information as a personal betrayal. For years he had considered Himmler a symbol of absolute obedience, the most faithful executor of his will. Now he saw him as a deserter. He locked himself in his office, furious. He slammed the table, tore up documents, shouted confused orders. Himmler's betrayal was added to that of Göring, who days earlier had tried to proclaim himself Führer's successor from southern Germany. For Hitler, this confirmed his final view of the world. Everyone had betrayed him. After hours of anger, a strange serenity overcame him. He called Bormann and Goebbels and announced his decision. The time had come to write his political testament. He did not want to die without leaving a record of his thoughts, without establishing his definitive version of history. It would not be an intimate document, nor a confession. It would be a declaration of principles, a final order directed at the future. He ordered his secretaries to prepare to type under dictation. The task began around midnight. In one of the smaller rooms of the bunker, a table was cleared and a lamp was set up. The secretaries, exhausted but silent, sat in front of the typewriters. Hitler entered accompanied by Bormann, Goebbels, Krebs and Burgdorf. His face was rigid, his tone meticulous. He had regained for a moment the authoritative cadence of his speeches. He dictated each sentence slowly, with long pauses. Around him, the others remained standing, listening in silence, while the keys struck the paper. The text was not a farewell. It was a manifesto. In it, he reaffirmed his ideology, repeated his hatred towards the enemies he had identified throughout his life, and denied any blame for the destruction of Germany. He attributed the defeat to the weakness of the generals, to internal betrayal, to the lack of faith of the people. There was no remorse, not a single gesture of self-criticism. Every word was intended to project the image of an incorruptible leader, a victim of the ingratitude of his own people. For him, history should remember him not as a defeated criminal, but as a soldier who had fought until the end. As he dictated, the sound of the artillery mixed with that of the keys. The trembling of the ground made the glasses on the table vibrate. No one interrupted. It was as if, in that final act, all the sense of power he had exercised for years was condensed, a voice speaking and others writing. In the text, Hitler confirmed his decision not to leave Berlin and to die in the capital. He declared that his body should be cremated immediately after his death to prevent any display. He reaffirmed his conviction that the German people should continue the fight and named his successors, Karl Dönitz as President of the Reich and Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, and Joseph Goebbels as Chancellor. In the course of the early morning, Hitler also began to dictate his personal will. This second document was shorter, colder. It was limited to material matters, his belongings, the royalties of his books, and a final statement in which he asked that his wife, Eva Braun, share his fate. It was the first time he mentioned her in an official text. His tone, when pronouncing her name, showed no affection, only the need to close a circle. That union, which for years had been kept secret, would be formalized that same night. When he finished dictating, he asked for the documents to be reviewed. The secretaries typed copies, Bormann checked the seals, Goebbels signed as a witness. The papers were placed in numbered envelopes. Hitler watched the process attentively, making sure nothing was left incomplete. It was the same meticulousness he had shown in the times of power, now applied to the ritual of his disappearance. Shortly after completing the writing, Hitler called Eva Braun. She had remained in her room, aware of what was being prepared. She met him in private. No one knows what words were exchanged. When they returned, Hitler announced that they would get married that night. It was a symbolic gesture, more political than sentimental. He wanted to close his life with the appearance of order that had characterized his regime. Even in disaster, every act had to have a form, a protocol. The wedding took place shortly after 2 in the morning, in a small room of the bunker. The party official who officiated the ceremony read the legal formulas with a trembling voice. Hitler and Eva Braun responded with brief words. At the end, they signed the document. There was no celebration, no toast, only a respectful silence. Those present understood that this marriage was the prelude to suicide. Eva Braun, dressed simply, remained serene. On her face, there was no fear, only resignation. The ceremony was the last expression of normality within the chaos. After the marriage, Hitler reviewed the wills again. He ordered that 3 complete copies be prepared and that trusted messengers take them out of Berlin, with precise instructions. One was to reach Dönitz, another to the High Command of the Army, and the third was to be preserved as a historical record. Each messenger knew that he might not survive the attempt. Some managed to get out of the encirclement, others disappeared in the ruins of the city. But the Führer was calm. His legacy, he thought, was already secured. During the following hours, the atmosphere in the bunker changed. The tension transformed into a kind of solemn calm. Everyone knew that the essential had been done. The leader had left his final word in writing, and his death would now be an orderly act. A light breakfast was served, although few ate. Papers, empty cups, weapons and cigarettes piled up on the tables. The noise of the artillery did not cease, but the interior of the bunker had become almost mute. It was the silence of the fulfilled right. Goebbels remained euphoric. He spoke of the will as a historical document, a piece that would guarantee the purity of the cause. For him, it was the confirmation that Hitler's death would not be a defeat, but a transfiguration. Bormann, on the other hand, was more practical. He reviewed lists, organized shifts, calculated escape routes. Even within the ruin, he maintained the illusion of administrative control. At midday on the 29th of April, Hitler met for the last time with the officers in charge of defense. He listened to reports about the situation outside, but no longer showed interest. The Soviet encirclement was complete. The city center was being taken building by building. Communications with the rest of Germany were intermittent. Hitler barely nodded. His attention was elsewhere. He spoke briefly with Goebbels about the continuity of the government after his death, repeating the names designated in his will. He did so without emotion, as if he were reviewing a procedure. Eva Braun remained by his side, calm. Her presence contrasted with the tension of the others. She appeared kind, even smiling. Some witnesses would remember her as the calmest person in the bunker, perhaps because she had accepted her fate a long time ago. She walked through the corridors greeting the staff, asking about minute details, as if she wanted to imprint every face in memory before the end. During the afternoon, Hitler asked to see his dog. Blondie, his German shepherd, was brought to the room. He spent a few minutes petting her in silence. Then, in a gesture that baffled everyone, he ordered the cyanide to be tested on the animal. He wanted to make sure the poison worked. The dog died in seconds. Hitler watched the scene with a blank expression, without saying a word. Around him, the silence was absolute. In that cruel and methodical act, the last remnant of his mentality was revealed, absolute control, even over death. As night fell, the will documents were ready to be sent. The messengers received instructions, ammunition, and cyanide capsules in case they were captured. Some set out in the darkness through the tunnels that connected to the surface. The distant sound of explosions accompanied their departure. Inside the bunker, the air seemed still. That night, Hitler dined with Eva Braun and a small group of attendants. The meal was silent. No one mentioned the future. When it ended, he stood up, shook hands with each one, and thanked them for their service. It was a procedural gesture, but everyone understood its meaning. It was the farewell. Afterwards, he retired with Eva to their rooms. No one saw him again for hours. The political testament, written between midnight on the 28th and the early morning of the 29th, became the most representative document of the end of the Third Reich. It was not a confession, but an extension of the speech that had sustained him for 12 years. Every sentence was a reaffirmation of his distorted view of the world. The enemy was responsible for everything, loyalty must be maintained beyond death, and the sacrifice of the leader would serve as an eternal example. In Hitler's mind, that text was a form of immortality. If the Reich were to disappear, his word would remain as a testament to the ideal. That idea provided him with a strange calm. After dictating it, he seemed liberated. He spoke less, walked slowly, but his tone was serene. For him, history was closed. What was left to do was execute the end with precision. While the Reich crumbled above his head, he organized its disappearance as if it were an administrative act. In that contrast between ruin and meticulousness, the true face of the end was revealed, a power that, even in destruction, sought to impose order, the last gestures, fidelity and ruin. The dawn of the 30th of April arrived without light. On the surface, the sky of Berlin was covered by a dense fog and the smoke of the fires. The flames of the ruined buildings dyed the air with a reddish color that barely penetrated to the depths of the bunker. Down there, time had lost all meaning. The clocks kept marking the hours, but no one knew if it was day or night. Only the roar of the cannons served as a measure. Each detonation, each tremor of the ground, was a toll of the end. Inside, the corridors of the Führerbunker were silent. The lights remained on constantly, casting a pale glow on the damp walls. The voices had faded. No one spoke more than strictly necessary. The footsteps echoed hollowly. The air was dense, charged with fear and resignation. The sour smell of gasoline, stored in barrels, of rusted metal, of sweat that had been accumulating for days was in the air. It was the smell of confinement, prolonged beyond reason. Hitler had gotten up early. He had slept little, as in the last few nights. His countenance was that of an exhausted but calm man. There was no longer fury in his gaze, only a cold, mathematical determination. He had become his own sentence. He walked with difficulty, leaning against the walls. He ordered that he be left alone with Eva Braun for a while. The others waited in the corridors, not daring to speak. They knew that each minute that passed brought them closer to the end. In the kitchen, the servants were preparing a breakfast that nobody would eat. Eva Braun asked for coffee and a piece of bread. Hitler did not taste a bite. He checked the papers on his desk once more. The political will, the personal one, the last orders. Everything was in order. The man who had demanded absolute control down to the last detail maintained that habit even on the threshold of death. Every document was signed, sealed, distributed. Only executing what he himself had decided remained. In the middle of the morning, he asked to speak with his aides. He met with Linger, Günscher, and Bormann. He explained to them, bluntly, how they should proceed after his death. His body was to be cremated immediately, along with Eva Braun's, in the garden of the Chancellery. He gave precise instructions on the use of gasoline, the position of the bodies, and the exact place to carry out the burning. He did not want to leave remains that could be displayed. His obsession with controlling his image accompanied him to the end. When he finished speaking, he shook each one's hand. There was no solemnity, just automatic courtesy. He thanked them for their service. It was the farewell. On the faces of those present, fear and disbelief were mixed. Listening to the Führer calmly describe the procedure of his own death was something that no loyalty could fully process. Yet they all nodded silently, obedient until the last moment. Shortly after, he ordered that cyanide capsules be distributed among the trusted staff. He wanted to ensure that no one was captured alive. The bottles, small and opaque, were passed from hand to hand with the naturalness of an inventory. Some kept them in their pockets, others hung them around their necks with a thread. No one asked, no one refused. In the language of the bunker, accepting the poison was a sign of loyalty. The atmosphere became more dense. Conversations were reduced to brief sentences, almost whispers. Goebbels walked back and forth down the hallway, murmuring words that no one understood. His wife, Magda, stayed with the children in their room, writing letters that would not be sent. The little ones, oblivious to everything, played with wooden blocks, while the rumble of the bombs made the walls shake. Outside, the city was disintegrating, but inside, the discipline of the ritual still persisted. In the office, Hitler and Eva Braun remained alone. They had been married just 24 hours earlier, but that union was already conceived as a prelude to death. Eva dressed simply, in a dark suit, her hair carefully arranged. Her serenity contrasted with the chaos that surrounded them. She had chosen to accompany him to the end, without protests, without tears. When the door closed behind them, the silence of the bunker became deeper. No one tried to enter. Those present knew it was the moment the Führer had prepared for weeks. In the next room, the assistants waited, standing. No one spoke. Time stretched into an unbearable wait. Suddenly, a sharp sound broke the silence. A shot, followed by a sharp chemical smell. There was no doubt. It had happened. For several seconds, no one moved. Then Linger and Günscher entered. What they saw was quick and precise. Hitler and Eva Braun were together on the sofa. She had poisoned herself. He had shot himself in the head. The scene was orderly, almost clinical. There was no drama, just the final result of a long-announced decision. The helpers acted immediately, following the instructions. They wrapped the bodies in blankets, carefully moved them down the hallway, and carried them up to the exit leading to the garden. Along the way, the explosions made the ground shake. Outside, the air was unbreathable because of the smoke and ash. They placed the bodies in a crater, poured gasoline, and set it on fire. The flame rose with a roar, momentarily illuminating the devastated surface of the Chancellery. Those present watched in silence. Some saluted militarily. Nobody spoke. The fire slowly consumed the remains, while the Soviet artillery continued to fall a few meters away. It was the last act of obedience, to incinerate the leader to erase his body but perpetuate his shadow. Back inside, the bunker sank into a thick silence. Hitler's death did not cause shock. It produced emptiness. It was as if the energy that sustained that world had been turned off. Those remaining inside, Goebbels, Bormann, the secretaries, the officers, kept moving out of inertia. Some cried silently. Others remained motionless, staring at the ground. No one knew what to do. The ritual was over, but the confinement continued. Bormann assumed the coordination. He confirmed that Hitler was dead, that the succession orders of the will were coming into force. He reported that Karl Dönitz, in the north, was to be notified immediately. Goebbels, for his part, formally accepted the position of Chancellor, even though he knew that this title no longer made sense. The machinery of the regime continued to function, although it no longer had a head or purpose. It was an administrative parody of power. During the following hours, the bunker transformed into a space of ghosts. The sounds faded, the conversations were hushed. Some took refuge in the rooms, others drank in silence. Goebbels remained seated, staring blankly. Magda visited him and whispered that she had made her decision. The children would not survive. In the logic of fanaticism, death was preferable to surrender. None of those present stopped her. Obedience had replaced compassion. That night, Magda Goebbels moved through the corridors of the bunker in silence. She carried with her vials of morphine and cyanide capsules. One by one, her children were put to sleep and poisoned in the room where they slept. The youngest did not understand what was happening. The subsequent silence was absolute. No one intervened. It was the final sacrifice in the name of loyalty. When it was over, Magda returned to her husband. Both remained together for hours, without speaking. Outside, the bombs continued to fall over Berlin. On the following morning, on the 1st of May, Goebbels wrote a final letter in which he confirmed the death of Hitler and declared that he and his wife would follow his example. After delivering the message, they went out to the garden, sat next to the exit of the bunker, and committed suicide. Their bodies were doused with gasoline, but the flames barely consumed them. The smoke from the fire mixed with that of the city in ruins, becoming indistinguishable from one another. Inside the bunker, there were few left. Bormann attempted to organize the escape. Some officers and staff members prepared to escape through the tunnels. The secretaries were divided into groups. Some were allowed to leave, others were ordered to stay. Gunfire was heard closer and closer. The defense of Berlin was collapsing. Even so, some insisted on maintaining formality. Orders were written, reports were delivered, greetings were made with military rigor. The final hours of the bunker were a succession of automatic gestures. In one corner, a guard checked his weapon. In another, a secretary burned papers. The electrical generators failed intermittently, leaving intervals of total darkness. The air was unbreathable. The smell of burning mixed with that of humidity. The generators failed, and the twilight turned faces into shadows. The air was dense. No one had the strength to speak. Those remaining were trapped between duty and instinct. Outside waited the Soviets. Inside, only ruins remained. Loyalty, which for years had been the supreme virtue of the regime, had now become its form of death. Every act, from the incineration of Hitler's body to the murder of Goebbels' children, was the extreme expression of an idea, unlimited loyalty. What began as obedience transformed into collective suicide. The bunker was not only the physical end of the Reich, but the perfect representation of its logic, the denial of life in the name of power. In the empty corridors, the creaking of the structure and the distant rumble of fire could be heard. Some guards whispered prayers, others waited for the signal to flee. The city above was already partly occupied by Soviet troops. The sound of the tanks mingled with the shouts of combat. But underground, the few survivors remained motionless, prisoners of a loyalty they did not know how to abandon. Bormann was one of the last to attempt to escape. Along with a small group, he went through the tunnels and ruins. No one ever saw him alive again. Others died in the attempt or were captured. The bunker was left empty, illuminated by light bulbs flickering over tables where there were still cups of cold coffee, half-consumed cigarettes, and papers signed by a non-existent regime. The end of the Führerbunker was not a bang, but an extinction. There was no confrontation or glorious conquest, only inert bodies, silence, and smoke. What had begun as a total domination machine ended reduced to a handful of loyal followers destroying themselves. In that gesture of self-immolation, the ideology that had guided them was consummated. Absolute contempt for life, both one's own and others. The ruin of the Führerbunker was the mirror of the entire Reich, a structure built on obedience, crumbled from within. Incapable of surviving its own leader, silence after the shot, the end of the Führerbunker. When the smoke from the garden dissipated and the flames began to extinguish, the bunker descended into a silence that was not human. It was the silence after the collapse of an idea. The walls, blackened by the smoke of the cremation, vibrated with the last impacts of the Soviet fire that continued to devastate Berlin. On the surface, the Reich Chancellery was already a skeleton. Destroyed columns, collapsed roofs, corridors covered with rubble. Underground, in the damp and dark corridors of the Führerbunker, the machinery of power had ceased to exist. Those present who still remained inside did not utter a word for a long time. No one knew how to react to Hitler's absence. They had lived for years orbiting around his figure. Without him, the world was meaningless. Some walked aimlessly, like sleepwalkers. Goebbels and his wife were dead. Bormann had fled or had attempted to. Secretaries, assistants, doctors and guards remained, all aware that the end was approaching for them too. The air was thick, saturated with the smell of gasoline and lifeless bodies. The echo of footsteps resonated over puddles of filtered water from the ground. The electric generators still worked, but their hum had become irregular. In the empty rooms, there were plates with untouched food, stopped clocks, cigarettes smoked down to the filter. It was the trace of a world that had stopped moving, suspended in a time that no longer belonged to anyone. Outside, the Soviet troops advanced street by street. Berlin was a field of ruins. The soldiers of the Red Army moved among burning buildings amidst columns of smoke and dust. The artillery had reduced the capital of the Reich to rubble. Thousands of civilians and German soldiers, trapped in the basements, awaited the end without knowing who would kill them first, the enemy or the collapse. Every hour, the tanks moved closer to the heart of the city. Underground, the noise of the tracks could be heard like a constant tremor that made the walls of the bunker vibrate. For the few who remained inside, time became liquid. The hours blurred together. Hitler's death brought no relief or liberation, only a strange sense of emptiness. Some began to talk of surrendering, others of fleeing. But the corridors were labyrinths with no safe exit, and every rumor about the surface mixed with fear. No one knew if the Soviets would accept surrenders or execute everyone indiscriminately. The line between resistance and survival had disappeared. During the following hours, those remaining in the bunker began to destroy the remaining documents. Files, lists, personal papers were burned. The flames of the metal baskets illuminated the exhausted faces. The secretaries, with eyes swollen from crying, fed the fires with typed sheets. Each document that burned was a fragment of the past being erased. The regime was literally vanishing into smoke. On the surface, the Soviets had already taken the Brandenburg Gate. Red flags waved over the remains of the Reichstag. The center of Berlin was under control. The soldiers advanced cautiously towards the Chancellery complex. They knew that there, in the tunnels and shelters, the last core of Nazi resistance could be hiding. The explosions and isolated gunfire continued, but the battle was decided. The Red Army had sealed the enemy's heart. On the 1st of May, in the morning, the bunker survivors received confusing news. Dönitz, from the north, had assumed command of the government and the army, fulfilling the provisions of Hitler's will. On the radio, communiques were still being broadcast that spoke of heroic resistance and continuity of the Reich, but no one believed them. It was the voice of a dead man transmitted over the airwaves. The new government barely existed on paper. In Berlin, power had disappeared along with its creator. Inside the bunker, the atmosphere was that of a mausoleum. Those present barely spoke, only exchanged glances. Some prepared to try to escape, others preferred to wait. The secretaries, too exhausted to cry anymore, kept busy cleaning, tidying, as if routine could preserve sanity. In each gesture there was a futile attempt to cling to normal life, even though normality had ceased to exist. In the afternoon, a small group decided to take the risk of going out. They gathered the essentials, documents, food, light weapons, cyanide capsules. The plan was to move through the tunnels to the outside and blend in with the civilians. It was a blind escape, but staying meant dying slowly. When the bunker doors opened, the outside air came in with an unbearable smell of smoke and corpses. Some crossed themselves, others simply ran into the darkness of the ruins. Bormann's group, Linger, Axmann and others took the route leading to the Weidendammer Bridge. On the surface, the chaos was absolute. The streets were covered with bodies. Soviet tanks advanced among smouldering buildings. Bullets whistled in all directions. The city was a labyrinth of fire. Some managed to move forward, others fell in the attempt. Bormann disappeared amid the explosions. None returned to the bunker. Those who remained knew that the end was a matter of hours. The Soviets were already surrounding the complex. The sounds of combat were getting closer. In the hallways, the air became thicker. The temperature rose. The smell of burning mixed with that of dampness. The generators failed intermittently, leaving intervals of total darkness. In those moments, the silence was unbearable, a void that seemed to absorb even the breathing. When the first Soviet soldiers burst into the upper levels of the chancellery, the bunker was almost empty. Some guards offered brief resistance, others surrendered without a fight. The Soviets advanced with flashlights, weapons ready, opening doors cautiously. The place was a labyrinth of small rooms, narrow corridors, scattered papers. On the floor were remnants of uniforms, suitcases, plates, cups, loose cables. They found no organized opposition, only traces of a world that had devoured itself. Upon reaching the lower levels, the smell of gasoline and burnt meat became unbearable. In the garden, the soldiers found charred remains. No one could recognize the bodies, but the nearby objects, the fragments of clothing, the dental pieces, confirmed what they already suspected. Hitler and Eva Braun had died there, incinerated according to their orders. The Soviets collected the remains with tweezers, placed them in metal boxes. There was no ceremony, just a forensic procedure executed with military efficiency. In the following days, the Red Army sealed the bunker and subjected it to inspection. Counterintelligence officers reviewed every room, every document, every object. The hallways, the beds, the desks were photographed. The remains of the Goebbels and others were collected. Everything was recorded, numbered, archived. The reports spoke of the confirmed death of enemy number 1. However, the secrecy with which the Soviets handled the information sowed doubts and legends. While in Berlin the victory was being celebrated, rumors began to circulate that Hitler had escaped, that his body was never found, that a double had taken his place. For years, those versions fueled the fantasy that the Nazi leader had survived. But for those who had been there was no mystery. They had seen him die, they had seen him burn. What was left of the Führer was ash and dust mixed with the garden soil. The silence of the bunker persisted long after the soldiers had abandoned it. The generators shut down, the lights went out. In the rooms remained the traces of the last days: disordered beds, coffee cups, pieces of paper. The air was rarefied by decomposition and humidity. The walls were still covered in smoke and soot. It was a cemetery of things, a place where time had stopped exactly at the moment of collapse. As the weeks went by, the bunker was sealed. The surface was cleared, debris covered the entrances. The Soviets did not want that place to become a sanctuary. In the following years, the land would be leveled, the remains demolished, and homes would be built over them. The exact place where Hitler took his life was lost under the new city. Only some maps and photographs would preserve its memory. The end of the Führerbunker symbolized more than the fall of a regime. It represented the dissolution of the myth. The place that had been the center of the most feared power in Europe was reduced to an abandoned basement. There, where orders had been given that cost millions of lives, only stains of dampness and silence remained. It was the clearest testimony that totalitarianism, as powerful as it may seem, always ends up devouring itself. On the surface, the German people slowly began to emerge from the ruins. Families searched for the missing among the debris. Children played with rusty helmets and pieces of shrapnel. The survivors walked among collapsed buildings as if waking from a feverish dream. No one spoke of the Führer, but his shadow was everywhere. The air itself seemed tainted by his memory. The Allies, upon learning the news of the suicide, reacted with a mixture of relief and caution. No one celebrated openly. The magnitude of the destruction prevented any feeling of complete victory. The war had ended in Europe, but the human cost was immeasurable. The cities were ruins, the fields, cemeteries. The death of the dictator did not erase the scars of the world he had created. The Führerbunker, with its concrete walls and its damp corridors, became the physical image of the end of an era. There, the obsession with control, fanaticism, and denial of reality were condensed. It was the final laboratory of absolute power, reduced to a handful of men who continued to obey even when there was nothing left to obey. In its windowless rooms, the myth of the eternal leader extinguished with a gunshot and dissolved into smoke. The silence that remained after the shot was more eloquent than any speech. It was the silence of a nation that had lost its voice, of a continent that had seen the worst of itself. No word could fill that void. The ruins of Berlin became the mirror of the moral collapse of a civilization. Beneath the ruins of the bunker lay the ashes of the Third Reich and the echo of its last cries, echoes of the bunker, memory and denial. Berlin awoke from the war like someone opening their eyes after a feverish dream and not recognizing the place they are in. The ruins stretched as far as the eye could see. Among the piles of bricks and steel, the survivors moved in silence, searching for water, food, or news of their loved ones. The air smelled of dust, smoke, and recent death. The entire city was an open grave. In the early days of May of 1945, the Soviet soldiers completely dominated the center. Among the rubble of the chancellery, the blackened garden still showed signs of the hasty cremation. The Soviets cordoned off the place and prohibited access. They did not want the site to become a pilgrimage point. Soviet research teams worked tirelessly in the area. They collected bone remains, dental fragments, documents, and scorched clothes. The bodies of the Goebbels were found in the vicinity. The remains believed to belong to the Führer were taken to secret facilities. The dental samples would later confirm the identity. But these proofs would remain hidden for years. The Soviet Union considered it more useful to keep the doubt alive than to definitively close the case. Thus the first echo of the bunker was born, the rumor. Just a few days after the fall of Berlin, stories of escape, doubles, and hideouts in the Andes began to circulate. The Soviets fueled these versions to maintain uncertainty. For the defeated German people, the idea that their leader had escaped was a way to postpone the shame. The official silence turned the truth into a labyrinth. Meanwhile, the bunker remained underground, invaded by seeping water. The walls became covered with mold. What had been the center of the most feared power in Europe transformed into a dark void where only the constant dripping of water echoed. During the following months, the Soviet authorities transformed the chancellery into a restricted military zone. Access to the bunker was blocked. Residential buildings were erected on the ground. The original entrance was sealed definitively. In official maps, the place was not even mentioned. It was as if it had never existed. The second echo of the bunker was obsession. In the years of the Cold War, Western intelligence agencies collected thousands of reports and testimonies. Alleged sightings of Hitler in South America were investigated, photos were analyzed, shadows were pursued. The Soviet authorities responded with evasions. The mystery served everyone, for the victors as a political weapon, for the vanquished as a survival myth. The Führer's remains were moved several times in secret, first to Magdeburg, then destroyed and scattered in a river. Stalin wanted neither grave nor symbol nor place of memory. The dictator had to disappear from the tangible world, but the physical absence did not extinguish his symbolic presence. The more his traces were erased, the more the legend grew. In divided Germany, the memory of Nazism was a wound that was dealt with in silence. In the West, economic reconstruction displaced the past. In the East, communist propaganda transformed it into an ideological tool. But on both sides, the bunker remained a taboo subject. No one wanted to admit that the end of the Third Reich had occurred in a suffocating basement, with a gunshot and a handful of loyal followers carrying out absurd orders. In the late 1980s, German researchers began to recover plans and photographs of the complex. The reconstructions revealed a symbolic truth. The Führer's final refuge was the most accurate portrait of his regime, a closed system without windows, sustained by fear and isolation from reality. When the wall fell in 1989, the topic of the bunker resurfaced strongly. In the 1990s, excavations confirmed its exact location. Beneath a parking lot on Gertrude Kolmar Street lay the remains of the Führerbunker. Almost nothing was left. Fragments of walls, collapsed corridors, sealed spaces. The German authorities decided not to rebuild it nor open it to the public. They feared it would become a place of pilgrimage for nostalgists of Nazism. In its place, a simple informational plaque was placed, discreet, almost invisible. There was no monument, no museum, no tourist guide, only a sign with a schematic map and a few lines of text explaining what had happened there. That gesture had a profound meaning. Germany did not want to glorify its past, but to confront it with sobriety. However, even buried under layers of concrete, the bunker continued to generate fascination. Cinema reconstructed it, literature reinterpreted it, memory turned it into a symbol, not as a tribute, but as a mirror. In each recreation, the Führerbunker appeared as the stage of the moral collapse of an era, the place where absolute power looked at itself and found nothing. Today, on the ground where the bunker once stood, residential buildings and a small parking lot rise. No sign indicates the exact place where the bodies burned. Passers-by go by without stopping. Children play, cars park, the shadows of the trees stretch over the asphalt. Beneath that ground, the concrete remains buried, silent, like a geological layer of the 20th century. But even in its invisibility, the bunker remains a persistent reminder. It is where the line that began on the streets of Munich in the 1920s ends and that passed through concentration camps, borders and wars. Everything culminated there, in a dark basement, with a shot and a silence. The history of that place holds an uncomfortable truth. Ideologies of death do not die with their leaders. They lie dormant, waiting for favorable conditions to be reborn. Therefore, the memory of the bunker is not just archaeology, but a warning. The echo of the bunker continues, not as a voice, but as emptiness. It is in the books, in the museums, in the conscience of a Europe that learned to distrust messianisms. When someone utters the name of Hitler, the sound inevitably resonates all the way to that basement. There ends his path, and ours begins. The attempt to understand how civilization could sink so low, and how it managed afterwards to rise again. The Führerbunker no longer exists as a physical place, but it persists as an invisible warning. Remembering it is not reliving it, but preventing silence from completely covering it. Because in that silence, denial can germinate again. The echo of the bunker is the echo of the century, a whisper that says, from the depths, that no ideology based on blind obedience and hatred can end in any way other than darkness. The concrete buried under Berlin is today an unnamed grave. Under those layers of earth rests the last vestige of the delirium that dragged the world to war. And above it, modern life continues its course. Bicycles, conversations, laughter, city noise. That overlap, life over ruin, is the most silent and deepest victory of all. There, in the darkness under Berlin's pavement, a dense, intact silence continues to resonate. It is not the silence of forgetting, but that of memory that watches,